Hey folks, Paul here. In the last Tackle Know-How video, we looked at how fishing lines affect bait and lure presentation. In this video, we're going to look more deeply into the lines themselves. We're going to look at the types of fishing lines out there, the properties that have been worked into modern fishing lines, the pros and cons, and then decipher the marketing speak. Okay, that's the language used by manufacturers to describe fishing lines, modern fishing lines. That language often seems more confusing than helpful. Hopefully this information that I provide will help you when you're deciding on lines for the types of fishing that you do. One thing I'm not going to address is which brand of line to buy. They're all good. In fact, they're all amazing. Technological marvels, every single one of them. When we hear complaints about certain lines, it's likely that that person had a damaged or deteriorated line, used improper or poor knots, had a bad batch, which is much less common than it used to be, or had misused or mismatched that particular line for the intended purpose. That said, you don't need a specialty line for every application, just like you don't need a specialty rod for every technique. They can be nice to have, and over time you may find yourself acquiring some specialty equipment as you go. But you do not need them to be effective. So, if you want the quick and dirty upshot here, I can tell you that all modern fishing lines are amazing, and that you can learn to catch fish on any and all of them. Get to know a line and go to town. Okay, that said, most of us want to know a little more. And of course there are differences between fishing lines worth knowing about. Some can actually help you catch more fish at times. But maybe more importantly, the right line can save you much frustration and self-doubt. Real-world challenges like fishing rely on confidence, and confidence isn't just an attitude, it's earned. Meaning, it comes with knowledge and experience. The natural world is a complex place, and fishing line, like lures, rods, reels, and screwdrivers, are all designed to address specific challenges. Some work better than others in certain conditions and circumstances. And in fishing, conditions and circumstances rule the show. The trick is to learn to recognize them and then apply the proper tools. Fishing line I've come to recognize as probably the most important piece of tackle we own in terms of getting fish to bite. In choosing fishing lines, it helps to know what's asked of them out there on the water, and how line manufacturers meet those challenges. Line materials sport a range of properties that must be balanced to make a good basic fishing line. And to better meet the more specific challenges that we anglers face out there, manufacturers have developed specific line formulas that prioritize some of these properties over others. However, manufacturers have to be careful how they describe a line to the lay public. Some of the biggest frustrations in fishing revolve around line troubles. We've all been there. You know what I mean. A fishing line marketer's job is as much about not spooking fishermen as it is about attracting them. Sound familiar? If you've been following my videos, it should. It's the age-old predator-prey relationship rearing up once again. Hence, the marketing speak that line manufacturers have developed to describe their products. To understand that carefully chosen language that truthfully often dances around the hard data, we need to understand the properties that underlie that language. So let's look into these properties, then try to decipher that marketing speak. Should be fun. Okay, what do fishing lines have to do out there? Just about every fishing line must cast, retrieve, present lures effectively, detect takes, set hooks, fight fish, survive abuse, and not frustrate the hell out of us. And then do it over and over again. That's asking a lot of any given string of molecules. Although all modern lines are technological marvels, truly, no one line type or formula does all these jobs equally well. So let's look into these basic properties of fishing lines. The ones I'm calling out here are break strength, diameter, limpness, stretch, durability, and buoyancy. Nearly every angler seems to focus on break strength when they're choosing a fishing line. And this would seem the logical primary parameter to look at when considering a fishing line. But I'm going to try to steer you in a slightly different direction, get you looking at something else as the primary parameter to use when choosing your lines. Everybody wants a strong line, so every line out there on the market touts amazing strength. And the truth is, they are amazingly strong. Every one of them. And I'll even go as far as to say at the outset here that all monofilament line types, that's both nylons and fluorocarbons, are pretty close in what's called tensile strength. That is, break strength per diameter. The relatively new braided lines are a different story in terms of tensile strength, which we'll get to in a bit. Monofilament lines are close enough to each other in strength that they are, for practical purposes, close enough to be considered interchangeable. The competition in the market is tight. For the manufacturer, the problem with prioritizing tensile strength or abrasion resistance alone is that to get that in a line, it will suffer the other qualities that actually make it fishable. No one wants to fish with wire. So all lines have some what's called manageability worked into their formulations. The trouble starts for us anglers when we go to choose a new line based on the typical standard used by most anglers, break strength or pound test. The number that we see printed in big bold type on every box of line out there. The problem is that even though tensile strengths are ballpark close, pound test ratings are not. In fact, they're not real data at all. First, almost all lines actually break at a higher value than their printed break rating. It's as if they're guaranteed to break over rather than under their reported rating. Fair enough. I actually care less about the number than I do my familiarity with that given line, how much pressure I can put on it before it breaks, and how it performs in terms of my presentation controls. That's depth, speed, and lure action, what we talked about in the previous video. And this last, presentation control, requires consistency. Gotta have consistency somewhere, and I can tell you it's not in the pound test ratings. Break strength ratings are not only imprecise, they're inconsistently so. This means that just because a line says 10 pound on the box does not mean it's comparable to another 10 pound line sitting next to it on the shelf in actual break strength. One may break at 12 pounds, another at 15, even though they're all, the formulations are close enough in tensile strength. What actually varies most is the diameter of each of these so-called 10-pound lines. Pound test ratings are more marketing categories than hard data. This is especially so for the specialized abrasion-resistant formulas out there that are especially popular for bass fishing. These lines tend to be much thicker in diameter than the standard lines, despite what the pound test label says on the box. The hard fact is that diameter alone accounts for more abrasion resistance than any other property. So it appears that manufacturers tend to up the diameter of a line when prioritizing abrasion resistance. And they do so without changing the pound test rating on the box. So how to deal with this inconsistency? Simple. Use diameter as the primary parameter when choosing your lines, not break rating or pound test. Remember, tensile strengths are ballpark close across all these lines. So diameter's the critical piece. Now, to be fair to the manufacturers, while diameter is pretty straightforward to measure, break strength is a greater challenge to measure in the real world. Under fishing conditions, actual break strength values depend on multiple factors. Knot strength, abrasion, shock, and friction resistance, and whether the line is wet or dry. So actual break strengths in real fishing conditions are tough to call. Happily, I've found that the diameters printed on the boxes tend to be pretty precise, even though I may bring a micrometer along to be sure, especially if I'm trying out a new line. Again, diameter is what counts. For the reasons we introduced in the first video on fishing line, diameter is the single most important factor in terms of presentation, in getting fish to bite. This is because line diameter is so significant to the fish's response to a fishing line's presence and to the fundamental presentation controls, depth, speed, and lure action. You can't set the hook and wrestle them in until they've bit. So line diameter is the most important property of the most important piece of tackle that we own. This is why I strongly suggest we buy our lines based on diameter, not pound test. We can even go a leap further and recognize that diameter alone can actually account for the majority of the properties we need from our fishing lines. Its strength, durability, limpness, stretch, and buoyancy. Okay, before we get into the nitty-gritty of these other properties, I'll provide you with this table to help you switch over to thinking diameter rather than break strength. The standard I'm using here are from lines like Trilene XL, Stren Original, and other similar standard formula lines. If you're an experienced angler and already have favorite lines, you could just as well take a micrometer to the lines you're already familiar with. This will allow you to identify your own standards by which you can compare other lines that you might be interested in trying, and still maintain that consistency in presentation controls. For example, if we're used to referring to our typical, say, finesse line as 6 pound, okay, instead we'll now recognize it by its diameter, 9 thousandths of an inch, or 0.009 as I call it. Or you could use a metric measure in millimeters, 0.23. Again, diameter allows us to cross-reference any line formula and maintain essentially the same presentation controls, regardless of how imprecise the marketer's break strength ratings are. Okay, with that mess out of the way, let's move on to the other properties that can weigh into our line buying decisions. Limpness is essentially how soft and supple the line is. Limpness is the main contributor to how smoothly a line casts and handles on the reel and in your hand. By contrast, a stiff, wiry line is apt to rattle through the guides on a cast, remain coiled on the water's surface, hindering detection. It'll wind loosely onto reel spools and create loose loops on the spool with any slack, which is a primary cause of tangles and headaches. Wiry lines make line twist, something that's inevitable in fishing, more pronounced, even causing the line to jump off the spool on spinning gear with any slack. Softer lines lay down on reel spools tighter, form loops less easily, absorb twist better, cast more smoothly, and simply lay on the water straighter. However, softer lines also tend to tear and shred more easily, making them less resistant to abrasion. Because of the importance of line manageability, new technologies are being introduced and applied to provide both manageability and durability together. Most modern lines today manage to provide some semblance of both. Like I said, they're all amazing. Stretch refers to how far a line will deform longitudinally when a weight or force is applied to it. It's usually reported in percent deformation or elongation. Most mono lines, both nylons and fluorocarbons, average about 30% stretch. So, as an example, I'll give you an idea what it looks like. 10 feet of line may stretch as much as 3 feet before breaking. But some controlled stretch formulas out there may stretch as low as 20%. All monofilament fishing lines stretch to some degree. Otherwise, their breaking point would come up mighty quick. Stretch is part of the recipe for producing shock resistance in a line that helps protect the line when, say, fighting large fish, especially when using smaller hook gaps, and for hook setting at close range. I'm sure you've had that happen. But stretch can be a hindrance at longer ranges when you have a lot of line out there. In hook setting, keeping pressure on a fighting fish, or for strike detection. Lower stretch lines can aid in detection sensitivity and in hook setting power, especially at distance from the rod. Durability comes in 4 flavors: abrasion resistance, friction resistance, shock resistance, and UV light resistance. Abrasion comes from hard objects that contact the line. Friction is the heat buildup that can occur when a line is rubbed rapidly against a dry object, such as our rod guides, or if we draw a knot tight too quickly. It can burn. Shock may be dealt by surging fish.
Whoa, you just saw me, didn't you?
Or when casting and when hook setting. Exposure to the ultraviolet or UV component of sunlight also weakens nylon-based lines. A day or two of fishing under bright sunlight is enough to severely weaken the nylon-based lines. A UV-degraded line often takes on a frosted or milky appearance. Fresh lines tend to be translucent with a shiny surface. In the more specialized abrasion-resistant formulas, manageability issues can appear. A totally abrasion-resistant line could end up simply unmanageable. Imagine spooling up with wire. It wouldn't get sawn off on a rock, but you'd never get your lure to that rock in the first place. Manufacturers have been able to add some abrasion resistance to their lines at the molecular level, while maintaining manageability. A true leap forward in engineering. Hats off to them. However, diameter still remains the biggest factor for abrasion resistance. Nylon-based lines also have an added disadvantage in that they absorb water, which effectively softens them, greatly reducing their abrasion resistance. Hence the reason that specialized abrasion-resistant lines tend to be thicker in diameter than the formulas that prioritize manageability. Buoyancy. Some lines float and others sink. This property can be important for a few good reasons. Floating lines can keep lures higher in the water column, act as strike indicators by their visibility on the water's surface, and low-mass lines can alight on the water's surface more quietly than heavier lines, which can help keep spooking down. Denser sinking lines work better for fishing deeper water. They also buck wind a little better, both in the air and in the water. In the air, because of their physical density, in the water by sinking below the water's surface tension, allowing the line to duck wind-generated surface currents that can create a pretty good bow in your line, affecting your detection sensitivity and hook setting. Okay, these are the properties that underlie the marketing speak. The language used to market fishing lines can be downright confusing. Marketers tout great properties using a string of adjectives, as marketers are wont to do. So, ads tend to read like, every line could be our best friend. And to be honest, most would. But, again, there are differences worth knowing about. So, understanding how line properties are marketed is important when we go shopping. Okay, I'm going to give you some key words to look for while you're reading the ads and reading the boxes in the line aisle. Words like handling, manageability, easy casting, castability, finesse, the mention of spinning reels, and walleye tend to refer to the limper, softer line formulas. Next up, abrasion resistance, okay, or the word bass. Lines specifically targeted to bass fishers tend to refer to a greater underrating of labeled break strength. Marketers would never say, this line has more abrasion resistance because it's thicker, but this is most often the case. Once again, that said, some added abrasion resistance is now worked into all modern lines at the molecular level. This is the toughness often referred to in the marketing speak for many, if not most, lines. This quality allows lines to be more resistant to shredding and to shock without losing manageability. Most manufacturers have gone this route, but still lines advertised as specially abrasion resistant or the bass formulas tend to be underrated in terms of break strength. That is simply thicker in diameter. There's another abrasion-resistant quality that exists that you don't often see on the boxes, actually. Friction resistance. And that's the ability to resist heat burn, usually by impregnating the line with a friction reducer like Teflon. The mention of shock resistance, you'll often see on the box, essentially tells us the line has molecular toughness and likely some added stretch. Visibility and invisibility are commonly used adjectives. In my experience, though, visibility to the angler, not to the fish, is the important consideration, as we covered in our first line video. There are three major types of fishing lines most commonly used in conventional fishing today. The monofilaments, okay, that is single-strand lines that are made of polymers, which are strongly bonded plastics, of which there are two main types: nylon polymers and fluorocarbon polymers, or mixes called copolymers. In the marketing speak, the term copolymer tends actually to refer to mixes of the various nylon polymers. Fluorocarbons are usually labeled separately, even though they're all polymers. The third type of fishing lines out there are the multifilaments, or braids, made from superfine specialized polyethylene fibers woven in a braided fashion, which gives the resulting line enormous tensile strength while remaining very soft and supple. In general, nylon monofilaments are tough, generally abrasion-resistant material with high tensile strength and good knot strength. They're manageable, especially when wetted. Nylons are buoyant, so they remain on or near the surface, an advantage for keeping lures shallow, and for providing visible strike detection by line watching. I use that quite a bit. They tend to have some stretchability, which can be a pro or con depending on the task. Nylons are vulnerable to UV degradation, which weakens the line considerably, sometimes over the course of a single sunny day of fishing. Badly sun-degraded lines, nylon lines, get a frosted or milky look to them compared to the shiny translucence of a fresh line, something you should be looking for. Nylons also absorb some water, which softens them and also weakens them considerably, especially in their abrasion resistance, at least until they're dry again. Nice thing is nylons are relatively inexpensive compared to the other line types. We often, change them out pretty frequently. Fluorocarbon lines, in general, are not buoyant, so they sink through the water column, an advantage in keeping lures deeper and in strike detection because your line can maintain a straighter line between that sunken lure and your rod tip. Buoyant lines create a greater bow in the line when fishing deep, pulling the lure upward with every movement of the rod or crank of the reel. Their mass makes them a good choice when fishing in the wind as fluorocarbon, as they buck the wind a bit better than lower mass lines. Fluorocarbons are generally less manageable as they tend to be stiffer, more wiry, and are less able to absorb twist. Some manufacturers now recommend only lighter, thinner diameter fluorocarbon lines for spinning tackle, usually under 10 to 14 pound tests depending on the formula, saving the heavier line weights for casting tackle, level wind reels. Fluorocarbon has the potential for better longevity than nylons because fluorocarbons are insensitive to UV light. However, fluorocarbons also weaken considerably when kinked or pinched, especially at issue with knot durability, being easier to kink or friction burn while you're tying. So fluorocarbons do require careful knot tying, and they also need to be checked for weak spots as you fish. So fluorocarbons will end up being whittled back after some fishing, just like nylons. Interestingly, this vulnerability to pinching and kinking counters the claims of abrasion resistance, often touted for fluorocarbons. Where fluorocarbon lines gain abrasion resistance lies in the fact that they do not absorb water, which greatly diminishes abrasion resistance in nylon-based lines. To gain appreciable abrasion resistance, fluorocarbons must either be made thicker in diameter or harder and stiffer, the latter especially making them wiry and hell on earth to fish, especially with spinning tackle. Finally, fluorocarbons are generally more expensive than the nylon monos. Okay, braids. Braids in general are extremely thin in diameter with very high tensile strengths, many times that of monofilaments. They have very low mass, which can be a big advantage, especially under high visibility conditions because they land on the water so softly. But such low mass lines also make them vulnerable to wind and breezes, potentially disrupting casting and detection. They have low to no stretch. They're highly manageable, okay, with no memory, although prone to self-knotting. Braids are buoyant, even more so than nylons, and they're insensitive to UV degradation. Braids tend to have lower knot strength than the monofilaments, being slick or slippery. So common knots that work well with monos will slip with braids. Braids have poor abrasion resistance, being apt to fray or shred against hard objects. And they're expensive, but they have, to counter that, excellent longevity when used away from hard abrasive substrates or when used with a monofilament type leader. They're so strong and thin, they can slice deeply into wet wood or your hands, so be darn careful. Braids now come in 4 and 8 carrier weaves, as well as fused formulas that essentially melt the fibers into a single strand. All tend to function similarly. 4 carrier weaves are rougher in texture and are used to saw through soft cover like vegetation. 8 carrier braids are smoother in texture, so they cast a little better and are much quieter in the guides. Now, braids may appear to be the answer to our prayers by addressing the primary importance of line diameter in our fishing. And at some level, braids are a step in the right direction. But braids have a few quirks that can create some disadvantages in some circumstances. First, using diameter as your reference point is true for braids as well. But with braids, break strength is not any issue at all. They're all stronger than your rod, all right? And they're all very, very thin. Instead, it's a good idea to choose body or mass often for handling characteristics. That is, go up in diameter, at least for some uses. A braided line the diameter of cotton sewing thread, while maybe plenty strong, may simply not operate well on your reel spool, in your fingers, or in a stiff breeze. So I'll provide you this table here as a reference of suggested diameters and break ratings of braids to match with common rod powers. Braids are extremely sensitive in terms of detection, owing to their near zero stretch. But they're also so thin and supple that that sensitivity essentially evaporates with the slightest slack in the line. Breezes tend to ripple slack through such a soft, supple, low-mass line, or create quite a bow of slack in your line. Breezes can also cause a lot of line drift on the cast, bringing your rod tip and lure splashdown out of line with each other. A bow again, greatly hindering control and detection. Their buoyancy and lightweight, however, does allow braid to be mended. Fly fishermen will know this term. That is, readjust the line after the cast with just a flick of the rod. We'll often throw the line in line and get it straight again. By comparison, the monos, being more massive and rigid, can provide some detection sensitivity even with a controlled bow in the line. Such as when the line's hanging near slack from your rod tip, or when a fish runs off with your bait at an unexpectedly steep angle. More massive, rigid lines can still provide some detection sensitivity by providing some tension to your rod. The sheer suppleness of braids also allows them to tie themselves into some incredible knots, or thread themselves into crevices and contours, anything they manage to drape onto. These can be frustrating, especially for beginners. Manufacturers, bless them, are hip to these issues and are working on adding mass and rigidity to some braid type offerings. So keep your ears to the ground, folks, and be willing to experiment. There are more breakthroughs to come. We may actually, at some time in the near future, come close to ridding ourselves to that biggest limitation in angling presentation, dealing with that chain that lies between us and those fish. Okay, I've been spending a lot of time online, and I'm not done yet. In another Tackle Know-How piece, I'll share with you how I use each line type in my fishing. And hopefully we'll hear from each other on how each of us applies different line technologies in our fishing. There's always something new to learn, always. It's the nature of fishing.
Okay, what's going on? I see, I've got a loop up front. It's hanging me up. Doesn't take much, does it? All right, try that again.